Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out today and amidst your busy schedule for this special webinar to learn about the narrative arc of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria through the lens and experience of longtime activist Steve Taylor. And we also want to offer a thorough update as to where the Global Fund stands in 2022 in terms of achieving its goals for 2030 amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a very important replenishment year, and Shannon and Mark will give us details as to what that means for 2022. Why your voice is more important than ever, and what you can do to help continue the life-saving trajectory for millions to combat infectious diseases, as well as prepare for the pandemics to come. So you guys know me. I'm Jenny Dyer, and founder of the 2030 Collaborative. As you probably know, we've worked on these issues for a really long time, and I've had the pleasure of working with Steve Taylor since about 2002. So I've known him since I was just getting into this work in 2002, and he was one of the first and foremost evangelical leaders who rallied the influencers to really take charge to promote awareness and do advocacy for HIV/AIDS in Africa. So it's just been really fun to get to know Steve and his family over the last 2 decades, and then to work with him on these issues. So he's going to share that story today. So, I've had a kind of a front row seat to watching the Global Fund for the last 20 years. Its inception was in 2003. Of this multilateral partnership. It has a kind of a 1-2 punch effect with our bilateral programs, PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative, and the USAID's TB program. So the Global Fund works in conjunction with these other programs, and they have led the way to save the lives of now more than 44 million people around the world since we were just launching this in 2002. I mean, honestly, it's just incomprehensible to even think of 44 million people. The US leads in funding and support. And for every $1 we put into the Global Fund, we require other countries and entities like businesses and foundations to provide a $2 match, just so you know where that stands. The Global Fund is truly the largest investor, helping local partners and communities fight these infectious disease pandemics around the world. And for the last 6 years, we've worked hand in hand with Friends of the Global Fight, and Mark Lagan and Shannon Kellman are with us today to help lead and manage the faith outreach to educate and activate leaders like yourselves on issues of AIDS, TB, and malaria. So today we have with us filmmaker, writer, producer, recording artist, rock star, Steve Taylor. And I'm just gonna give you a little bio. I'm gonna tell you, I've known Steve forever. And of course I've read his bio before, but I forget how incredible he is and all the amazing things he's done. So I'm just take a minute and listen to this career. So Steve earned his Renaissance Man stripes from a body of work that's garnered him multiple Grammy, Billboard, Telly, Addy, and Dev Awards and nominations. As a recording artist, he sold over 1 million albums, garnered 2 Grammy nominations for Meltdown and Squint, and made history as the only artist to twice win Billboard Music Awards for self-directed music videos. He also fronts the rock band Chagall Guevara. Did I say that right, Steve?
You did.
Okay.
Good job, because that was our first mistake.
Good. So whose new album releases July 1st, everyone, followed by a concert the next night at Nashville's famed Ryman Auditorium. I'm going to be out of the country, actually, or else I would probably be begging you for His resume as a record producer includes the platinum certified Sixpence None the Richer and 3 gold certified albums for the Newsboys, all with 4 albums earning Grammy nominations. His greatest success as a producer came with the Sixpence None the Richer's 1999 #1 international smash hit, Kiss Me, as well as the band's follow-up hit, There She Goes. His filmmaker resume as a writer-director includes The Second Chance for Sony and Blue Like Jazz, based on Donald Miller's New York Times bestselling memoir, which premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival and won the 2013 Wilbur Award for Best Feature Film. joining past winners The Help, Schindler's List, and Dead Men Walking. Steve's next feature film, The Independent, is slated to be produced in partnership with Viola Davis's Juvie Productions and SNL's Kenan Thompson, attached to star. He's also the producer of 2 upcoming feature films, Sun Moon for Sunny Affirm, which was shot in Taiwan, and Sketch, starring 2-time Emmy winner Tony Hale of Arrested Development and Beat fame, along with the New Kids animated series, The Dead Sea Squirrels for VeggieTales co-creator Mike Naraki. Steve serves as a filmmaker in residence at Lipscomb University here in Nashville, and lives here with his wife, the artist D.L. Taylor, and their daughter. So that is Steve's incredible background. But we also have 2 other speakers with us today from Friends of the Global Fight. So I'm just going to give you a brief bios on them too. So Shannon Kellman's with us. She's a senior policy director at Friends of the Global Fight. And she, in this capacity, she manages and leads congressional outreach and coalition relationships to advance advocacy on behalf of Friends. Shannon was previously the Assistant Director of Washington External Affairs at the Council on Foreign Relations. She worked in Congress as an aide to Congressman Jan Schakowsky and to Senator Carl Levin. Shannon also worked as a lobbyist at J Street and as the Development and Communications Associate for Pacific Environment, an environmental nonprofit based in San Francisco. Originally from Evanston, Illinois, Shannon holds a BA in Russian and Eastern European Studies from the University of Michigan and an MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics. She's a CFR term member and co-chair of foreign policy for America's Next Gen Initiative. And she was a 2017 Next Gen leader with the National Bureau of Asian Research and serves as a co-chair for Women in Government Relations, International Relations, and Trade Task Force. So thank you, Shannon, for joining us today. And last but not least, of course, is Mark Lagan. He is the Chief Policy Officer at Friends of the Global Fight Against AIDS, TB, and Malaria, where he helps shape the nonprofit's administration and congressional advocacy, faith, business, and international civil society partnerships and research content. He is also Senior Fellow at the dynamic faith-based Trinity Forum, an adjunct professor in the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. In the executive branch, he served 3 successive roles at the Department of State, on the state's policy planning staff, Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Organizations, and finally, Ambassador at Large, directing the Office to Combat Human Trafficking. In the NGO world, he served as president of the Freedom House and executive director and CEO of the leading anti-human trafficking nonprofit Polaris. I really like his book, Human Dignity and the Future of Global Institutions. So we have these great and incredible speakers. I'm going to pass it off to our keynote, Steve Taylor, to share his story.
Thank you, Jenny. And it's so nice to join all of you today. I should tell you, one of the reasons I'm standing up is because I have a bad habit of falling asleep during Zoom meetings. Not only while I'm listening during Zoom meetings, I actually once fell asleep while I was talking on a Zoom meeting. That is how boring I was. It was almost imperceptible. I was just droning on about something, and then I just went on as if nothing had happened, but I knew that I'd actually put myself asleep with my own voice. Not that standing up is any guarantee of staying awake. This is off topic, but I was a church janitor while I was in college, and I'd clean the church really late at night. And one night I'm vacuuming, and I was dead tired from finals, and it's 2 a.m. and I'm so bored doing that same repetitive motion, and I actually caught myself before I hit the carpet. So in fact, I only know one surefire way to stay awake during a Zoom meeting, and it is this. It is impossible for anyone to fall asleep while slapping themselves. So if you see me doing this while I'm talking, it's not just a nervous tick. So when Jenny and I and a handful of other Nashvillians working in media got together 20 years ago, it was in response to the AIDS crisis, and specifically to what was happening in Africa. And as Christians, we were motivated at that point by one astounding fact, that only a very tiny sliver of Americans who identified as Christians cared anything about the AIDS crisis in Africa. And this made no sense to us. It didn't jibe with the attitudes of the Christians we knew. It didn't make sense to us that organizations like Compassion International and World Vision were thriving within Christendom, and that our fellow American Christians were giving generously to help the neediest around the globe, and that as the gospel was spreading worldwide, so was the good news of Jesus commanding us to love our neighbors as ourselves. So how could we not care about the worst public health crisis to hit the African continent in generations? A crisis that was leaving millions of African children orphaned. So we went to work to try and change hearts and minds, specifically those of our fellow Christians. Now, my involvement, despite Jenny's kind praise, my involvement was by no means special or unique. But one of my main contributions was that I am such a skeptic. I knew what the church needed to do. I just wasn't so sure that our government needed to be involved. I knew at the time there were things our government does well. I just couldn't always remember what they were. So while our ad hoc group in Nashville was being inspired by the advocacy work of Bono and his data organization that soon expanded into the One Campaign, which we also got very involved with, and while we saw his passion as he met with US government officials at both parties, I've got to admit, I was thinking, yeah, but Bono's European. Like, he thinks governments solve more problems than they create, whereas I'm not so sure. But it is Bono. There aren't that many fellow Christians who are also world famous rock stars. So we need to help him connect with and inspire American Christians, even if I'm not sure it's gonna work. And that is what we did. Bono taped a PSA specifically for Christian music festivals, and we got it played at all the big Christian music festivals around the country that summer. He met privately with a group of about 40 Christian artists out at Charlie Peacock's house that same year. And he really inspired us when he met with us. He inspired us to create our own PSA to help the cause, along with talking about the AIDS crisis in Africa from our concert stages across the country. And by mobilizing an army of church people and soccer moms from largely middle America, we formed the political backstop to allow then President George W. Bush to create PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which became the largest commitment by any nation in history to address a single disease. But even with all that forward momentum and government involvement, I still wasn't convinced this was going to work. Look, I'm a filmmaker and a songwriter. I tell stories for a living. I know all the tricks of my trade. I know that to get people emotionally involved, they need to hear stories. It needs to be personalized. But since I'm a skeptic, that stuff doesn't work so well on me. And then it became very personal. So earlier I mentioned the work of Compassion International, a Christian child sponsorship organization that my wife and I have been involved with for decades, sponsoring children, helping them raise money, and even visiting the kids we sponsored in Africa. They saw the work I was doing with Bono and the One Campaign, so they contacted me and said that they felt like Compassion had been slow to respond to the AIDS crisis. So could my wife Debbie and I come back to Africa to see the work they were doing and give them some added advice and perspective. So we went and we visited a number of their schools and daycare centers like we'd always done before. And this time we also visited an orphanage that they just opened to help care for AIDS orphans in Uganda, a country with 2 million AIDS orphans at the time. And when we got to the orphanage, we did what, we always did. There was kids around, we hung out with them, we played with them on the playground, we had lunch with them, they did a little performance, just the same thing that typically happened every time we went to one of these locations in Africa to see what the work that Compassion was doing. But this time was a little bit different because I noticed that the smallest girl at the orphanage was following my wife around just like her silent shadow. Wherever my wife went, she followed. And she just became like her kind of special friend during those 4 hours that we were in that orphanage. She sat on my wife's lap when they did the program because she was too little to be involved. She at one point motioned my wife to come and follow her because she didn't speak any English, but she knew how to motion. And so my wife followed her back to her room where she got a drink of water, drank the water, and then went back and joined the group. And at the time, when we finally got around to leaving the orphanage, I could tell my wife did not want to say goodbye to this little girl. And I thought, well, that was sweet. And then a couple of days later, my wife and I are in Kenya, and my wife says, hey, what would you think about adopting that little girl, Sarah, that we met a couple of days ago? This came as a surprise. We did not have any kids. We'd waited a long time before we tried having kids because I was on the road all the time. And then we tried and weren't able to have kids. And I just thought, well, you know, that's okay. We'll be fine. So this was kind of a bit of a curveball, but I said, well, let's pray about it and let's find out what all would be involved. Probably sounds really complicated, but we got back to the United States. I contacted a friend who spent a lot of time in Uganda. He said, well, you couldn't have picked a worse country. He said, you have to foster the child in the country. I think it was for 4 years before you're able to adopt anyone out of Uganda. And at that point, I don't think there was really any international adoption being done anywhere in Africa. But he said he had just helped put together the Congressional Coalition on Adoption to travel to Uganda a couple months earlier and meet with the First Lady of Uganda. I guess Congress has a hard time agreeing on anything, but evidently they all think that helping orphans is good. So there was a bipartisan commission, and they asked the First Lady if there was any chance that Uganda might open up the country to international adoption, because if it worked there, chances are it would work in other countries in Africa. And so, long story short, we became the test case for the State Department and the Congressional Coalition to see if they would allow international adoption. It took 9 months, funny enough. And at the end of it, we were able to travel to Africa. We were able to adopt our daughter, Sarah, and she is now 25. She's got her own apartment in East Nashville, and she is living every millennial's dream. She is working for TikTok. So yes, this issue is personal, but here's the big news for skeptics like me. It is working. In the last few years, we've learned that one of the things we need our government to do well is respond to disease outbreaks. And despite some missteps, they've done a pretty good job in helping create and distribute life-saving vaccines and medicines and PPE in this country in record time, a job we know the public sector couldn't have done on its own. But that didn't come as a surprise to me, because here's what our government's programs have done over the last 20 years in conjunction with the Global Fund. They've reduced the death toll from HIV, TB, and malaria by 56%. And in countries where the Global Fund invests, we've seen a 74% decline in AIDS-related deaths, a 42% decline in TB deaths, and a 47% decline in malaria deaths. And that one strikes especially close to home because when we adopted our daughter, she, like many African children, had malaria. All told, our government's actions, as Jenny said, have saved 44 million lives. And millions of those lives are African children, just like my daughter, who are alive because we did this. The skeptic in me has been convinced this work works, and that's why we need to keep doing it. So thanks, and Jenny, back to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Gosh, we love Sarah so much, and thank you so much for your support for so long from the beginning till even today. We appreciate you and your leadership on these issues. Shannon, do you want to follow Steve and give us a little bit more background as to what's going on with the Global Fund today, this year, and how we can kind of get involved with that?
Do I want to follow Steve? Not particularly, but I will do my level best. As Jenny mentioned, I've spent my career working in and out of government on a number of humanitarian issues, so, and have been at Friends for just about 4 years now, working on support for the Global Fund. I think one of the key things and where I want to start is that Steve said it, and it bears repeating frequently and loudly, is that PEPFAR and the Global Fund would not exist if not for the support of the faith community. We know, I mean, these are our initiatives from second President Bush, and we know that he would not have spearheaded these initiatives without hearing from leading voices in the faith community, including, I think, many of the folks on this call, to really call for a concerted and compassionate response to HIV, TB, and malaria. Where we are right now is a complicated place. As Steve noted, and as Jenny noted, the Global Fund and its partners have saved 44 million lives in the past 20 years. The past 3 years have been very, very difficult. As COVID has impacted us here in the United States, it has had dramatic impacts around the world, and in particular on the HIV, TB, and malaria responses. And this is the first time in 20 years that we have seen any results from the Global Fund backtrack at all. And that is because when COVID hit, it hit those most vulnerable populations. It hit those who are already susceptible to disease, who are already living with diseases like TB and HIV and malaria. And it takes a lot of effort to make sure that those existing disease responses, which are hard to put together and hard to get off the ground, were able to adapt to COVID when it hit in low and middle income countries. And so a lot of where we are right now is sort of a good news, bad news situation. We didn't see the results that we feared. We were living in a world in late 2020 where we expected the disease response for the 3 diseases to backtrack nearly 10 years in response. And we didn't see quite that level of detriment to programming, but we did see some pretty significant impacts from COVID. We saw a 22% decrease in HIV testing, a 19% decrease in TB treatment for drug-resistant TB, which is what keeps me up at night, and around a 5% decrease in testing for malaria. Now, a lot of these programs were able to adapt, and I think we saw some really great benefits and lessons learned from the fight against the 3 diseases that we were able to put towards COVID. Things like a test and treat protocol that has been part of the HIV response for the entirety of the Global Fund's existence has become a really key central point for how we test and treat for COVID. We were able to adapt things like malaria bed net distribution, which used to be like a town center. Everyone would come and collect their bed nets and then go back to their homes. And with COVID and the emphasis on social distancing, again, things we've all lived through, the malaria programs were able to shift, and they went, instead of a town center distribution point, they employed community health workers to distribute them door to door. And that actually increased usage of bed nets because the community health workers were able to have more personal conversations. And so in fact, of the 3 diseases, tuberculosis was hit the hardest, and malaria actually managed to sort of maintain where it was because we were able to adapt some of those programs. And some of those community health workers in low and middle income countries are very closely tied. In fact, in a great many places, work with or for faith-based organizations in their respective regions. Now, COVID has had a very different impact in low and middle income countries than it has had in the United States. But it is one thing that, like, we know the investments that we have put into HIV, TB, and malaria have paid dividends. The support for health systems, the support for laboratory workers, we all remember at the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, the fear of sort of what was going to happen if doctors got sick, what was going to happen if there weren't enough ventilators. In many low and middle income countries, the number of ventilators can be counted on both hands. And so for patients who got very sick with COVID, there was not a ton of treatment that was available to them. And those systems that we developed for the HIV, TB, and malaria response were able to play a pretty significant role in addressing, the basics of behavior. Folks know about contact tracing because they've been living in tuberculosis endemic regions, right? Like, this is all tied together. The machine that is used to diagnose COVID in many low and middle income countries is called a gene expert machine. It's sort of looks like a big mini fridge. That is also used to diagnose tuberculosis and COVID. And so a lot of these things, they don't exist in silos, right? They don't exist in like, you're only tackling one disease, then that's the money we're going to put towards that one disease and that will solve that one problem. These all have spin-on effects. The Global Fund, in early portions of the pandemic, stood up what it calls its COVID-19 response mechanism and fundraised money specifically for that to help countries address the COVID response and mitigate impacts on HIV, TB, and malaria. And since it was created in May of 2020, has dispersed more than $4 billion with a B to low and middle income countries to over 100 countries to help both address COVID directly and help address some of the impact from COVID I was just speaking about. And the Global Fund is really the leading organization on what I call sort of the everything but vaccines response. They're a leading player in that Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, which is the consortium of international groups brought together to help address COVID-19. They're a leader in addressing diagnostics, in addressing treatments, and making sure that sort of the health systems connector, the umbrella of it, is able to be supported as well. So they do everything that isn't vaccines. And essentially, if you are in a low and middle income country today and you have access to COVID tests and you have access to COVID treatments, that is because of the Global Fund. They are pretty much the only player in this space, and the money that has been raised from donor governments, the $4 billion, has played a really significant role. The US contributed a great deal of that money. Of the $4.3 billion, they contributed 3.5. And so Steve's skepticism about government contributions and how governments can help in this situation is very well noted, and generally I agree with him in a lot of ways. But the US government was able to really step up in this instance and has done a lot of really tremendous good. As Jenny mentioned, 2022 is sort of a big year for the Global Fund. It is a replenishment year. Global Fund fundraises on 3-year cycles they call replenishments. And this year, the US is hosting. It'll be in New York in September. And it is this inflection point. We are at a moment right now where we have weathered a good portion of the COVID storm. It is by no means past, and we are by no means out of the woods. But we are at a point where a decision essentially has to be made by those who are able to make it, of are we going to commit ourselves to finally ending the 3 diseases as we know them, as pandemics, as epidemics, or are we going to see these numbers and these death rates creep higher and higher and higher? And so this is a moment where the current administration is hosting replenishment, but is very dependent on other donors, other contributions from G7 countries, from the private sector, from foundations, to really commit to ending infectious disease as we know it right now. If we have a fully funded Global Fund, we will reach a point by 2026 where the death rate, the sheer number of deaths from HIV, TB, and malaria would be below 1 million a year. I can't emphasize that enough. When the Global Fund started, the idea of deaths being under 1 million a year was a pipe dream. It was a fantasy. And the fact that we have that within reach is something that we need to make sure that we are emphasizing and continuing to double down on to make sure that we get to a point where there are no deaths from HIV, TB, and malaria. And that is well within sight. The US plays a significant leadership role in this as a host of the replenishment and as the largest donor to the Global Fund. The ask of the Biden administration right now is a $2 billion a year contribution. That is a $6 billion pledge for the 3 years of the 7th replenishment. That was included in the president's budget request. So we're really excited to see that. We have great bipartisan support in Congress. I like to joke that our 2 biggest champions on the Hill are Senator Lindsey Graham and Congresswoman Barbara Lee. And I cannot think of 2 people who are farther apart on literally every other issue than Senator Graham and Congresswoman Lee, except for the Global Fund, because they both recognize what the Global Fund brings to the table and the life-saving capacity that it brings to infectious disease response. 2 last points, because I already feel like I've gone on a bit long. The Global Fund works very closely, as Steve noted, with PEPFAR, with the President's Malaria Initiative, with the USAID TB program. The Global Fund works in about 120 countries. PEPFAR works in 55, PMI works in just over 30. And every PMI country that they work in, they have to work in a Global Fund country. The same holds true for PEPFAR. The 2 programs, the US bilateral programs, work very closely with Global Fund partnerships, and in fact are very dependent on each other. There's they collaborate on supply chain so that Global Fund is buying this kind of treatment and PEPFAR is buying that kind of diagnostic. And they're able to really build off each other's advancements. One of the challenges that's difficult in my job that I do with Mark is that we are fundraising for the Global Fund from the US government, but we need to make sure that that money is not coming from the US bilateral programs. It needs to be in addition to, because essentially we don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul. This is, investments in global health needs to go up broadly, not just the Global Fund needs to get more money at the expense of these other programs. And then last but not least, the Global Fund benefits from this match requirement that Jenny mentioned, that for every dollar the US contributes, $2 needs to come from other donors, primarily other country donors. That has been an extremely useful tool to leverage contributions, because it means that the US has already announced they're going to put $6 billion on the table, and it is up to other donors to match that or to leave money that the US in theory would have committed. So we've seen already great movements towards that $18 billion goal and the increase of 30% that we're asking of all donors. So we already saw Luxembourg announced its pledge last week with an increase of 30%. Germany is doing this sort of like the incremental increase. They've increased 20% and they're saying quietly they'll get to the extra 10% increase. So we have every reason to believe that Germany would get to that full 30%. Contributions from the European community are expected to come probably sometime in the next couple of weeks. We're seeing great things from countries like Spain and Australia who are willing to, Spain is going to double its contribution, which is very exciting. It looks like Australia will increase somewhere around the 50% range. Seeing really great things to be excited for. The flip side of that are some of the countries that are giving me a little bit more anxiety than I would like. The UK in particular has had a bit of a day, a week with its political system. And so we need more advocacy there. So it's a lot of working with our international partners to make sure that that 30% increase comes from the world as a whole. It's not just the US sort of, putting its foot on the gas, it's bringing everyone along with it. I think I'm going to stop there because I feel like I've covered quite a bit, but I'm very excited to answer any questions as folks may have them.
Thanks, Shannon. That was awesome. Mark, do you want to?
A few last thoughts. I'm not brilliant, although I will say that hiring Shannon was brilliant. I'm sharing my own personal perspective as a believer, as a professor, as a pragmatist about policy as well. There is something special about the Global Fund in that it's not like traditional international organizations like the UN or the World Bank. It's not only governments and their parochial interests, pardon the expression, the fact that it includes civil society, the people who are affected and living with AIDS, TB, and malaria, the private sector, a blend of faith community and civil society implementers, has made it work well. And though the secular lingo is these are stakeholders, but the way the Global Fund is run at its board and the way it operates, it will only give money to groups of people in countries that are more than some national health ministry, but local communities and private faith secular actors. There's a justice lens for the Global Fund, and President Bush was wise to offer the first pledge of any country to the Global Fund. He and the administration I served in with him were quite skeptical about international organizations, or some of them. But we now talk a lot about equity, like who has access to vaccines internationally, among the poorer countries or the poorer people within countries. But there are all sorts of other aspects of equity, access for everybody considered equal, in the eyes of the Lord. So as Shannon alludes to, all the other aspects besides vaccines of dealing with COVID-19, whether it's PPE or testing or drugs for people who get COVID, the Global Fund has tried to have a lens of access to the least of these, the most vulnerable, the stigmatized, as it has always done with AIDS, TB, and malaria. That's in its DNA from the beginning. It reaching out to those people who are most stigmatized or discarded by societies and governments, for instance, who have HIV and TB. That's its métier. The Global Fund has not operated only in silos. Not only has it cooperated with the really valuable US programs like PEPFAR or the President's Malaria Initiative, but it has seen that to get the job done, to move towards an end to the epidemic status of AIDS and TB and malaria, it needs to strengthen health systems in countries of the global South. And it needs to think about the frontline people, not just health ministries, but community health workers, for instance. The midwife who's paid little or nothing, but being connected to a larger system so that as a new pandemic arises, or you're trying to make progress on the three major pandemics the Global Fund was created to deal with, that they're helped. And those qualities of prioritizing health systems will be really great for helping countries be more resilient for inevitable future pandemics, because COVID is not going to be the last one, not just the last strain of COVID, but new pandemics will come. And so the Global Fund's work in order to get the job done on AIDS, TB, and malaria that has strengthened health systems, significant part of its investments, has really helped the outsider, the disposable person in the eyes of too many in societies. And this is in our self-interest. I mean, to help prepare for pandemics that arise has an impact on the United States and those who are in our communities and congregations. Because as our friend Senator Bozeman of Arkansas says, a pandemic is only a plane ride away from the US and harming our brothers and sisters here in the United States. So anyway, I think the Global Fund has been one of the more valuable things that the American people and the US government have used, and investing in it, as well as some of the bilateral programs like PEPFAR, allows the United States to offer a proper humanitarian moral leadership role, because everyone knows the United States pays a third of the budget of the Global Fund, and that makes the other 2/3 come in from other donors. It's time that the United States should stand up for the values of every person having worth, equal worth, and being able to survive and thrive, rather than having their hopes and their God-given gifts snuffed out all too early by a disease. That's all.
Thank you, Mark. So now we've got a little time, and I just want to open this up, and if there's any questions from anyone for Steve or for any of us, we'd welcome that.
Comments.
Or comments, of course.
Jenny, you have a number of people here who have worked with you and with us over time. I know a number of them myself. Is there something about, you want to speak to about the role of people of faith in advocacy, which is sort of at the heart of what you do professionally and in terms of your heart?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so, for folks on this call, I see Todd Schneck and Renee Lewis and David, just to name three. I mean, we've worked with these guys, particularly Renee and David, in their context of global health work for a long time. So they are on the front lines with their nonprofits. Renee Lewis works for Renee. You want to share about yourself, but she's with Project MetaShare in Haiti with Dr. Bart Green out of Miami, and then David has had a long time nonprofit in Haiti, and now he's doing work in Jerusalem. So they know the need. Many folks in the evangelical faith community know the need. They're on the front lines through their missions work. They're traveling to these countries. They have sister organizations and churches in these countries. And, poverty is systemic. There's needs for water and education and primary health. And they're seeing all this maternal and child health, and the list goes on, but they also are seeing the impact of these three diseases. So in terms of getting involved, there is a deeper level, I think, from the faith community because of bearing witness to these issues in other developing nations. We've provided kind of a three-part easy way for folks to get involved. One, we have a faith-based coalition in support of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. We run out of the 2030 Collaborative. We would invite any and all leaders of faith and others to join this coalition with a united front to let members of Congress know that there is a cohort of leadership across the United States that does support the Global Fund, and then also, to Shannon's point, PEPFAR, the President's Malaria Initiative, and our TB programs as well. The second thing is about 2, sometimes 3 times a year. Steve knows this because I've bothered him for 20 years, for many times a year. We've asked for signatures, your signatures on letters. And then we take those letters to members of Congress on the Hill. We email them, or we take them in person, or whatever the case may be. And we let our members of Congress know, that you care about these issues, and they know where you live and, your name and what entity you're from. And then the last thing we would ask is if you could take a minute of your time and email or call your member of Congress or, your senator, your representative, and just let them know that you care about, as Mark put it, the dignity and worth of every human and their opportunity for health. And by that, you support the Global Fund. It's really that easy. It's not a daunting task. There's likely an 18-year-old on the other end that will answer the phone and will jot down your name and your message and carry it to the member of Congress. But as my former boss, Senator Bill Frist, who was the majority leader, used to say, if there were 300 Americans who called about the same issue, it rose to his level. It got to his desk. And 300 people is not that many people, frankly. So it doesn't take much. Your voice means so much. It really does have it is a powerful tool to save millions of lives. So those are 3 great ways. Obviously, you can contact me to get more involved,
I remember one night it was late and I remembered, I didn't make my call. So I called Senator Cooper's office, and the phone was, said, sorry, I didn't think anyone would pick up the phone. Is Senator Cooper there? He said, this is him. So he went from a little initially grouchy to happy to help. So yes, it works. Hey, Jenny, could you talk about the significance of the year 2030?
Yeah, sure. And probably Shannon or Mark could even do a better job, but we're even named the 2030 Collaborative for a reason. The Sustainable Development Goals are shooting to, end hunger and a variety of other, global health issues. including these three pandemics by 2030. And, you know, as Steve knows, we've moved the ball down the court a little bit over the last 20 years, but we've, you know, and the Friends of the Global Fight have mapped out well a trajectory in which there is a real course of action that could end the epidemic levels to which Shannon spoke earlier by 2030. Now, COVID-19 did throw a wrench in this, and there's been a little bit of a J curve because it disrupted the programs of people getting the proper medications, prevention, treatment, but they're moving back on track. And it's still a true possibility. And that's just one in which, I mean, to Shannon said earlier, and Steve, you and I probably were overwhelmed in 2002. I would have never guessed we would have seen that day, no. You know, but it's 8 years away now. So I don't know if Shannon and Mark want to add to that, but, you know, again, like, this is epic for our generation. I mean, I think it will go down in history as one of the greatest achievements that we will have contributed to. That is our generation. So it's really, truly exciting to be a part of this program.
You know, this is a really interesting moment to be working on global health. We're actually celebrating, this is a very well-timed webinar, Jenny, because this week is the 41st anniversary of the first morbidity and mortality report that the CDC put out on HIV. It actually wasn't called HIV at that point, but this is the week. So, you know, we're at 40 years of a disease that has killed millions. Right. TB and malaria are diseases that have been with us for centuries. And as scary as those timelines are, we all just lived through a pandemic where we had a vaccine in under a year. You know, if we put the time and money and effort and political will into addressing disease, it is astounding what we can come up with. Peter Sands, the executive director of the Global Fund, likes to say, you know, there's this pandemic raging around the world. It's killing millions of people. It's brand new, except that it's been around forever. And he's talking about tuberculosis. We have a tuberculosis vaccine. It largely doesn't work. It's also more than 100 years old. There is no HIV vaccine. There is actually, just in the recent past, in the past year or two, there's been the development of a malaria vaccine that is very effective in combination with other malaria responses. And so when we talk about trying to reach a point at 2030 where these diseases are no longer killing millions of people, where these diseases are no longer endemic anywhere, it's within reach, in a point where it feels like if we do the work now, it's fully possible, and we just don't want to let it slide out of our grasp. As Mark said, we know there will be other pandemics. We know there will be other diseases. If we put the time and effort in now, we can prevent the mass impact that COVID has had on our lives, and we can prevent living through another disease like HIV, which has been around, is a relatively new disease, but something that we can stop before it gets to the point where it's killing so many. And so we're at this moment where I think we all have sort of a big choice to make about how much we're going to commit to making this possible.
You know, it's an issue of values and prudence. You know, I personally think that we're called to reach out to those who are stigmatized or in poverty, and help them be cured, help empower them to take their gifts and live with them. But practically speaking, you know, what Steve says, it's reasonable to be skeptical about public institutions, government, and international organizations. We see them go awry or not deliver. But when you see something that does work, as the business people would say, scale it up.
Also, just to throw out there, I used to be the person who answered phones in those offices, you know, you all calling and bothering your member of Congress or your senator. I spent more time than I care to to acknowledge talking to people who were really angry about something. And it was my job to listen. It was my job to then take it and go to my boss, go to the congresswoman or the senator and say, okay, so what are we going to do about this issue? The benefit of elected representatives is they have to listen to you one way or another. And so the more we are raising our collective voices and going to them and saying, look, we have the support of these groups and these luminaries, and also like, you should just care because it's human lives at stake. The more they have to listen. Benefit of being in advocacy is that the louder you are, the more effective you are. So there's really no ceiling that you could hit.
We have a rendering of what a couple $2 billion would buy, and thinking tangibly about, how many people more could be on treatment, or, could thrive, or have, be shielded from being hit by these diseases. My colleague John has just popped up a thing, but it's a way of thinking about tangibly, money well spent. Thanks to those of you who have been partners over time, to raise your voices on behalf of those who could live rather than perish.
David?
Yes, I just had a quick question, probably a long answer, may not have time for it. But, one of the things I think that the most recent pandemic has exposed is a weakness in our public health system in the United States and certainly in other countries. And I just wondered if you could give us a 50,000-foot view of the impact the Global Fund might have in strengthening those infrastructures.
Do you want to take this? Because I touched on some of that. Abroad, the kinds of things that the Global Fund has already invested in and could do more of, so that countries would be ready not just to fight the pandemics that have existed for decades or last couple of years, but any that come. It's not just clinics and facilities, laboratories. I mean, you can't treat someone unless you can test and see whether they actually have been exposed. I mentioned earlier community health workers. I think it's worth thinking about those health systems in particular places, right on the front line. And in many places, for instance, in Africa, the capacity there is a faith-based group. We've worked closely with Anglican bishops and other, local faith groups that are the ones providing the care. And just those, if the US system has had a lack of resilience, imagine what low and middle income countries might have. So those are some of the ways.
Also, just to throw out there, broadly speaking, there are essentially 4 kinds of disease. Let's see if I can actually remember them now that I've said it. There's viral, bacterial, fungal, and parasitic. Of the 3 diseases that the Global Fund works on, they've got HIV, which is a virus. They've got tuberculosis, which is bacteria, and they've got malaria, which is a parasite. They don't work on a fungal disease, but they've got 3 of the 4. And so if you're talking about how do we respond to what might come next or what we're facing, those kinds of responses are already built into the system that the Global Fund is working on to address those gaps, as you highlighted, David. And to say that, like, when we talk about pandemic preparedness, we're talking about making sure that, like, we can test for anything and everything. Because if you're a parent, if you're a mom and you have a sick kid, you take your kid to the doctor, you don't say, hi, my kid has tuberculosis. You say, hi, my kid has a cough. And tell me what's wrong and tell me how to fix it. Because that's all you care about. You don't care if, like, how many millions of people have had tuberculosis before your kid. All that matters is your kid. And that has to be the focus. It has to be on the human impact of all of this, where we're addressing, sure, the 3 deadliest infectious diseases that the Global Fund works on, the deadliest infectious diseases on the planet right now, but also that we're laying the groundwork for whatever comes next. Because when we talk about pandemic preparedness, it's all well and good to talk about building laboratories and making sure there are diagnostics, but we can't just prepare for whatever disease comes next when there are people dying from diseases today. And all of this is tied together, and all of these systems help save lives from all of these diseases. It's all, again, as I said before, it's not siloed. It's all, iterative impacts. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Shannon. Thank you, guys. I'm afraid our time is out. So I just wanted to say a special, huge thank you to Steve Taylor for his time and his dedication to these issues for 20 years. It's just been so incredible, the kind of impact he's had on both the Christian community to uplift these issues, but also on members of Congress to shape policy. So thank you so much, Steve, not just for today, but for all of your support. It's just been monumental. Thank you also, Mark and Shannon, close colleagues. Thank you for joining us today with your wisdom and knowledge on the Global Fund. We really appreciate you giving us a thorough update on what's going on. And thank you guys, everyone, for joining today. We really appreciate it. And this is recorded, so we're going to be able to send it out. We would welcome you to share this with your constituents, your friends. And again, don't hesitate to contact me at jenny@2030collaborative.com if I can provide you any good materials or links or language that we can continue to educate and activate the American public, and particularly the faith community, on these very important issues to save lives. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, Jenny. And Steve.
Thanks, Jenny. Bye.
Nice to see you all. Bye.